Cliff Richard is 83 years old now, and for most of his life he has been asked the same question: what did Elvis Presley really mean to him? To fans, the answer always seemed obvious. Cliff was the United Kingdom's first homegrown rock and roll idol, the boy with the guitar who filled dance halls and was quickly crowned England's Elvis. Yet for 50 years, there was something he never said. Now in the twilight of his career, he has finally broken that silence. And what he revealed about Elvis Presley is not the story anyone expected. It is more human, more complicated, and more haunting than the rivalry the tabloids love to print. So why did Cliff Richard keep this hidden for 50 years? What was the truth he finally admitted about Elvis Presley? And why does it change the way we remember them both today? In the late 1950s, Britain was restless. The war had ended more than a decade earlier, but the country was still rebuilding, its youth searching for something alive, modern, and unapologetically theirs. Across the Atlantic, they had already found it. Elvis Presley exploded onto radios in 1956, his voice blurring gospel, blues, and country into something raw and electric. For teenagers, it was liberation. For parents, it was scandal. Elvis was more than a singer. He was a cultural earthquake. Cliff Richard was 17 when he felt that tremor. Growing up in Cheshire, north of London, he had moved from colonial India with his family and found music as his escape. When he heard Elvis, his dreams sharpened. Here was a performer who could command a room with nothing more than a sneer, a hip shake, and a song that felt dangerous. Cliff studied every movement, every inflection, absorbing what it meant to not just sing but perform. By 1958, Cliff found his chance. His single "Move It" roared onto the charts, a gritty rock track unlike anything Britain had produced. Suddenly, he wasn't just another teenager with a guitar, he was a star. Overnight, he became the country's first authentic rock and roll idol, and the press gave him a title he never asked for: England's Elvis. At first, the comparison gave him credibility. Fans embraced it too, screaming for him in cinemas, mobbing him at train stations, holding banners that declared him the British answer to the king. For a while, it seemed like destiny. Two young men, born worlds apart, now sharing the same cultural wave. But beneath the surface, Cliff felt the weight of that crown. Every performance was measured against Elvis. Every hit song was dissected for similarities. Critics asked whether his career could survive once Presley released his next record. Cliff longed to be seen as his own artist, not just a reflection of someone else's shadow. Even without meeting, the two men were tethered in the public imagination. Elvis had given Britain its first glimpse of rock and roll, and Cliff became the one who carried it forward. The press painted them as rivals, but Cliff's feelings were more complex. He admired Elvis deeply. He longed to one day stand in the same room, to measure himself not through headlines but face to face. That moment never came, and it was the absence of that meeting year after year that began to shape the truth Cliff would carry with him for the rest of his life. For Cliff, Elvis was never just a distant star. He was the standard by which every step of his career was measured. From the first moment he saw Elvis strut across the screen in Jailhouse Rock, Cliff felt the ground shift. Elvis wasn't simply singing. He was commanding the air around him, bending an audience to his will. Cliff left the theater electrified. He realized that if music was going to matter, it had to be lived, not just played. That realization drove him through his early years. Cliff learned how to lean into a microphone, how to move his body, how to carry a song with attitude as well as melody. He could never deny that those lessons were drawn straight from Elvis, yet when asked in interviews he softened his words. He praised Presley as an influence, but he stopped short of admitting just how much of his stagecraft came from studying him. In the early 1960s, Cliff's fame in Britain soared. He was selling out theaters, leading the Shadows on world tours, and becoming a household name. Reporters began asking the inevitable question: when would Cliff Richard meet Elvis Presley? The thought thrilled him as much as it terrified him. How would it feel to stand before the man who had shaped his artistic identity? The opportunity seemed close more than once. When Elvis finished his military service in Germany, Cliff was already performing across Europe. Rumors spread that their paths might cross at a film premiere or a studio party. Cliff reached out through mutual contacts, hoping to arrange even a brief introduction, but managers, schedules, and protective entourages kept the men apart. Colonel Tom Parker, known for shielding Elvis, rarely encouraged casual meetings. Still, Cliff kept waiting. Each time he toured America, he wondered if this would be the moment. Yet the meeting never came. Journalists asked whether Elvis considered him a threat. Cliff, always gracious, smiled and brushed the questions aside. Inside, though, the ache deepened. The irony was sharp. Cliff had been called England's Elvis for most of his life, yet he had never shaken the man's hand. Fans believed they must have been close. Cliff let them believe it. The reality was lonelier. Two men, endlessly compared, never once able to speak face to face. By the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard had become a fixture in British entertainment. His singles filled the charts, his films drew box office crowds, and television specials confirmed his place as the nation's most bankable star. Yet behind the fame, Cliff faced a challenge that few saw clearly: how to grow as an artist while still being tethered to a comparison he could not escape. The Beatles were rewriting the rules of music, the Rolling Stones were pushing boundaries, and a new generation of bands was stealing the spotlight. In the United States, Elvis remained a giant name, but his career had entered an odd chapter. After dominating the 50s, he was now locked into Hollywood musicals, some charming, many forgettable. Critics began to wonder if both Elvis and Cliff were relics of a fading era. For Cliff, the pressure was relentless. If Elvis released a ballad, Cliff was expected to counter with one of his own. The press painted them as competitors in a transatlantic tug-of-war, as though every chart position was proof of victory or defeat. Cliff rarely pushed back in public. He avoided bitterness and kept his answers diplomatic. But privately the weight grew heavier. He admired Elvis and never wished him failure, yet he longed to be seen as his own man. The irony was painful. His greatest triumphs were often credited to the shadow he supposedly stood in. Meanwhile, Elvis himself was fighting battles no audience could see. Behind the bright lights of Hollywood, he felt trapped by his manager's choices, reduced to formulaic scripts and recycled soundtracks. When he returned to live performance in the late 60s with his famous comeback special, he clawed his way back into relevance, proving he was still the king. Cliff watched from afar, aware that the man he had once studied was now struggling to preserve the crown everyone assumed was unshakable. It was here that Cliff's feelings toward Elvis deepened. He recognized the parallels, the burden of expectation, the fear of fading into irrelevance, the exhausting comparisons that never seemed to stop. The tabloids might have thrived on rivalry, but Cliff felt something closer to kinship. That recognition that their careers were bound by more than headlines was part of the truth Cliff would carry for decades. In public, Cliff Richard was polite whenever Elvis's name came up. He praised him as an inspiration, smiled at the comparisons, and gently shifted the conversation back to his own work. But behind the curtain, Cliff's feelings were more complicated, and his efforts to reach Elvis more persistent than most fans ever realized. During the early 1960s, Cliff tried more than once to arrange a meeting. His manager, Norrie Paramore, passed messages through music industry circles in both London and Los Angeles. Elvis was constantly touring, filming, or under the watchful control of Colonel Tom Parker. Even when Cliff visited America, he found himself blocked at every turn. Invitations that seemed certain fizzled out. Calls went unanswered. At first, Cliff assumed it was bad luck. Over time, he began to suspect something more deliberate. Colonel Parker was known for protecting Elvis's image with ruthless efficiency. To Parker, the idea of Elvis being linked too closely with England's Elvis might have been inconvenient. Cliff's very nickname suggested imitation, and Parker rarely tolerated stories that placed Elvis alongside equals. Whether it was coincidence or strategy, Cliff soon realized the door to Presley's circle was closed. The rejection stung. He had dreamed of speaking with Elvis face to face, not as rivals but as artists who understood the same pressures. He wanted to thank him for the spark that had ignited his career, and to finally measure himself against the man who had inspired it all. To discover that he was being kept at a distance felt deeply personal, even if Elvis himself may never have known. Yet Cliff carried on with quiet dignity. He never accused Parker or the Elvis camp of shutting him out. Instead, he masked disappointment with gratitude for his own success. Still, the longing never faded. He followed Elvis's films, his records, his comeback. He celebrated the triumphs from afar, and when rumors of decline reached Britain, he listened with concern that went beyond curiosity. Fame had a way of isolating both men. Cliff, despite his clean-cut image, often wrestled with loneliness and the demands of a career that left little space for a private life. Watching Elvis battle his own demons, Cliff felt the parallel, and it deepened his regret that they had never spoken, not even once. In the end, it wasn't rivalry that haunted Cliff. It was the silence. The unanswered calls, the missed chances. Two men bound by destiny, yet kept apart by circumstance. That silence grew heavier with each passing year. And when the news broke in 1977 that Elvis was gone, Cliff understood it would never be broken. The 1970s were a time of reinvention for Cliff Richard. After a decade of chart dominance, he faced questions about whether his style still belonged in a world of glam rock, disco, and folk protest. For the first time, his popularity wavered. He returned to his faith, began singing songs that reflected his spirituality, and leaned into a quieter, steadier career. On the surface, it looked like a man adapting gracefully. Yet just beneath, Cliff was watching another figure, Elvis Presley, fight a very different battle. Elvis's struggles had become impossible to hide. The Las Vegas residencies that began as triumphant returns were starting to take a toll. Each year, his schedule grew heavier, his performances more erratic. The press speculated openly about his health. Fans whispered about prescription drugs, weight gain, and exhaustion. For Cliff, who had spent 2 decades being compared to him, the sight was heartbreaking. He recognized the signs of a man drowning beneath the demands of an industry that rarely showed mercy. Cliff had felt the pressure himself, the late nights, the endless tours, the loss of privacy. He could not imagine the scale of it for Elvis, who carried the burden of not just stardom but myth. From Britain, Cliff followed every headline, every photograph, not as a rival, but as someone who understood too well what fame could do to a man. Then came August 17, 1977. Cliff was preparing for another show when word reached him. Elvis Presley had been found dead at Graceland. He was only 42 years old. To the world, it was a shock. To Cliff, it was something more piercing. He felt the loss not as a fan or a peer, but as someone who had always believed deep down that there would be a moment, just one, when the two of them might finally meet. With Elvis gone, that chance was gone too. Cliff later admitted that the news shook him to his core. He had built his life around the inspiration of a man he never met, and now there would be no closure, no words exchanged, no chance to say thank you. It was grief mixed with regret, strong enough that he could not bring himself to share it publicly. For fans, Cliff appeared respectful, offering condolences and praise for Elvis's contribution to music. But privately, he struggled with what felt like unfinished business. He had carried admiration for decades, waiting for a moment that never arrived. Elvis's death turned that waiting into something permanent. That was the turning point. The silence Cliff had once chosen now became unbreakable, and it left him with a truth he would not reveal until many years later, that the shadow of Elvis Presley was not rivalry at all, but a wound, one that shaped his life in ways no one ever suspected. After Elvis's death in 1977, Cliff Richard faced a choice. He could finally speak openly about the connection he had always felt, or he could protect himself and Elvis's memory by keeping it hidden. He chose silence. For years, Cliff avoided elaborating when Presley's name came up. He offered warm but careful words, admiration for the music, respect for the career, acknowledgement of the influence. He never confessed the depth of his disappointment, never admitted the regret that haunted him. To fans, it looked like restraint. To Cliff, it was a shield. That silence served more than one purpose. Cliff was determined not to be reduced to England's Elvis forever. Speaking too much about Presley would only invite fresh comparisons, fresh headlines that erased his own identity. He had survived the radical shifts of popular music, found a second life as a spiritual artist, and maintained a career that endured long past his contemporaries. He would not let that be overshadowed by a story of rivalry. Yet Elvis never left his life completely. Cliff occasionally included Presley songs in his sets, singing them not as imitation but as quiet tribute. He spoke of the man's charisma, of the way he changed music forever. But behind those tributes was sorrow. Sorrow for the meeting that never happened. Sorrow for words left unsaid. Privately, Cliff admitted to close friends that Elvis's death had unsettled him. It wasn't only grief for the loss of an icon. It was grief for the unfinished part of his own life. He had spent years preparing for the day when he could finally express what Elvis meant to him, and that day vanished. That conversation remained forever unspoken. Fans assumed the two men must have met at least once. The myth endured because it felt impossible to imagine otherwise. Cliff never corrected it. Allowing people to believe was easier than confessing the truth, that he had lived in another man's shadow without ever once standing in his presence. For half a century he carried that contradiction. The man who defined his path was also the man he never knew. Only with age, as Cliff looked back across the long stretch of his career, did the silence grow too heavy. At 83 he finally broke it. When Cliff Richard finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 50 years of silence. Reflecting on his career, he admitted what he had never dared to confess when he was younger. Elvis Presley was not simply an influence, he was the figure who had shaped Cliff's identity from the very beginning, the unreachable standard against which he always measured himself. Cliff revealed that the endless comparisons had never been about rivalry, they were reminders of a relationship that never existed. He had longed to meet Elvis not as an imitator seeking approval, but as a fellow artist hoping for recognition from the man who unknowingly gave him permission to dream. What he carried was not resentment, it was regret. Regret that he never looked Presley in the eye and said thank you. For decades, Cliff kept this hidden because it felt too vulnerable. Admitting it would mean acknowledging how much of his own story was tied to someone else's shadow. He wanted to prove that his career stood on its own. Only with age, when his legacy was secure, did he allow himself to be honest. Elvis had haunted him, not as a rival but as a brother he never met. Cliff described the pain of watching Presley's decline from afar. The photographs, the whispers, the image of a giant collapsing under the weight of his legend, and realizing he could offer no comfort. He confessed that this absence remained the greatest unfinished chapter of his life. For all his records and accolades, the silence between him and Elvis was the one thing he could never change. When fans heard his words, many were stunned. They had assumed some meeting must have happened. To learn the truth cast his long career in a new light. His diplomacy, his careful restraint, his refusal to fuel rivalry, it all came from a place of respect and longing. By finally admitting it, Cliff offered Elvis a tribute more profound than any imitation. He acknowledged that his career, no matter how distinct, would never have existed without Presley's spark. He allowed the world to see him not as a competitor, but as a man shaped by admiration, regret, and silence. At 83, Cliff's revelation was not designed to shock. It was to close a circle left open since the day he first heard Elvis's voice. And in closing it, he revealed the humanity behind the headlines. A man who built his life in the shadow of another, and who only in his final years admitted how much that shadow had meant. Cliff Richard's confession at 83 was not about rivalry, but about silence. For half a century, he carried the regret of never meeting Elvis Presley, the man who had shaped his path and haunted his legacy. By finally admitting the truth, Cliff reminded fans that even legends can feel unfinished, even icons can live with quiet wounds. Elvis gave him the spark, but time denied them a connection. Now that truth belongs to history, linking them forever. For more emotional stories, check out this video.